and welcome to Unstress. I'm Dr Ron Ehrlich. The subject of environmental toxins is one worth touching on again today. How are we exposed to it? How does it affect us? What can we do about it? Now, you could throw your hands up and say, look, it's just too much. Nothing I can do about it. But if you are listening to this podcast, I'm guessing you're just not that kind of person. In order to deal with the problem, in order to solve a problem, I believe it always helps to know what that problem is. I love personal empowerment, and my guest today has taken that message of personal empowerment on well and truly. She's a concerned parent, as you will hear, but also an educator and author. It's Alexx Stuart. Now, Alexx, as you will hear through her own experience, isn't that the best way of learning, has a passion, a gift for making this information accessible and doable. Her broad message is low tox living. That's not no tox, because we do live in the real world. And now this message also clearly resonates with me, and I hope it does with you. After all, we are striving for a life less stressed, knowing that in our modern world, there's no such thing, or at least I don't think there is, of no stress. We also mention and discuss something called Mthfr, a genetic mutation which actually affects 10 to 20% of the population. I'll explain that in a little more detail in the wrap-up after I talk to Alexx, so stay tuned right to the end. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Alexx Stuart. Welcome to the show, Alexx.
Thank you so much, Ron. Thanks for having me.
Alexx, you have this program, you have a book coming out. We're going to talk about all of that, called Low Tox Living. But, you know, we are both quite aware of these issues around environmental toxins, but we kind of shouldn't assume that everybody is. So I thought we might start with Low Tox Living 101. What does it mean?
Okay, so to live a low tox life is something that I literally invented as a concept probably about 7 or 8 years ago, when I was thinking of starting my blog after everything that I had learnt so far. And I kind of had come to the realization that you couldn't live in the modern world and be completely free from environmental toxins. It's actually not possible. You walk past a car and that's it. Or whatever, you kiss a friend who's sprayed a perfume and it's got synthetics in it. So I really didn't want people to feel like there was such a thing as perfection that we were all striving for, because I think that really leads us down a little bit of a negative path, and you can become quite angry and upset that you're not doing enough or achieving enough or clean enough. I hate that word. So I really wanted to create this sort of sense that we could just strive day after day, bit by bit, step by step, to live a life that's more in line with one that gives us health and one that looks after our planet. And that's how the low tox life, not no tox, was born.
Great. Oh, well, it's just, I think that the reality is, as you say, we're not perfect. And I know this shocks my listeners, but I know I'm not. And I dare say, you might not be either, Alexx, but we can strive for something. Now, why don't we you've also got these 3 or 4, actually, great courses. And I thought they gave a great structure for our conversation today. Because going low tox, why don't we deal with, say, personal care products? There's quite a lot of those, and maybe we could just focus on a couple just to give people a sense of what this is all about.
Yeah, sure. So when we look at our personal care, it depends on which catchphrase from which media outlet you follow, but in essence, we're using tens of hundreds of chemicals on our skin every day, and we're led to assume that these have been extensively tested, both independently and by companies, but they haven't. And the other aspect of that is that a lot of the chemicals that are in there have never been tested synergistically, i.e. one might be okay or mildly irritating, but then you add it to another one and a whole bunch of stuff can happen. And that's not tested for very much at all in terms of the research I've done. So that kind of upset me when I first found that out. And then I wanted to start looking at what might be the most important things to phase out and replace. And I came upon the idea that a certain group of chemicals were endocrine disruptive. And if you think of our endocrine system, it's all of our hormones, so not just sex hormones. A lot of people talk about estrogens and estrogenic chemicals, but really we're looking at things that disrupt the thyroid, kidney, sex hormones, adrenals, you name it, all of them, right? And in terms of our personal care, one of the major places we will find an endocrine disruptive chemical is in something that's been synthetically fragranced, because within the term fragrance or parfum, as you see on a label, you can have up to 140 or thereabouts chemical compounds used in that term just to make that thing. And they don't have to disclose any of what those are. So
what is the term, Alex? What is the, you said what is the term?
Parfum. So parfum or fragrance.
Oh, okay. Okay. So they can just put a label, fragrance, and that could describe up to 100 or more chemicals.
It absolutely can. And in fact, Unilever is going to be the brave first multinational to come forward and say, we will be listing on our websites what is actually used in those fragrances. And I think it's from next year. So, there's change afoot based on consumer demand to know what's in our products, which is really, really awesome. But by the same token, we certainly don't want to be waiting to find out what's in things. And unfortunately, often something that's in these fragrances, especially those ones, and if you could think about saying hi to a friend and then it feels like they're with you the whole rest of the day, even though you've kissed them goodbye long ago because their perfume keeps lingering, that vibe?
Mm-hmm, I do.
Yeah, so the job of a chemical called a phthalate is to make something sticky, make it last. And in fragrance land, that means long-lasting fragrances. So phthalates are one of these endocrine disruptive chemicals, and you have to be wary of it being in any of those terms where you see fragrance or parfum and there's no asterisk that tells you it's made from essential oils. So that's a really big one. And it always kind of freaks people out because once you start thinking, okay, well, what have I got that's synthetically fragranced? It's probably going to just be my moisturizer body cream. But no, it's our shampoos, it's our scented candles, reed diffusers, all those sorts of things, fabric softener, you name it. So it transcends personal care massively and goes into things like toys and all sorts. Think of like the old... what did we have when we were little? Strawberry shortcake toys. My sister loved those and they were all scented. And that was sort of one of the first scented toys. And now kids are using scented crayons from funky shops and things. And there's just nothing funky about it because they're extremely toxic to us in the long term. So, but back to personal care, it's just really important to start thinking, okay, if you see that and if you know it's a synthetic fragrance, then you switch to a natural one. It stops you from having to look through every single ingredient on every single product. Just go off whether it's a synthetically or naturally fragranced product first, because that will be the most brilliant and easy way to rule out a whole bunch of stuff. And then the other thing that I would probably suggest with your skincare is to just have a look at the preservatives that are used. And you might have antibacterial aspects that are used. So triclosan has been found to be damaging to the thyroid, and you would know that that's in lots of the mainstream toothpaste.
Well, it's a big seller, isn't it, in so many home care and 99.9% antibacterial.
I know,
this
it's
is a
ridiculous.
whole other topic, isn't it?
We've become terrified of bacteria, but that, yes, as you say, it's a whole other conversation. So, triclosan rethyroid, and interestingly, the FDA in the US has even ordered that triclosan be taken out of all the hand washes and hand sanitizers because no one has actually been able to prove that it is any more antibacterial than soap and water. So we've been damaging our thyroids all the while thinking we were doing something good by using this antibacterial stuff, and meanwhile it's actually turns out that it's not so good for us, and it doesn't even provide the promise that the chemical company that produced it said that it would. So definitely look for triclosan, and you'll see that in a lot of acne products, teen products, antibacterial catchphrases on the front, as you said, the home care products as well, like multi-purpose sprays, but also your toothpaste, because it's in the best-selling toothpaste in the world. So I want to get that one out and switch to a more natural one.
No, good point. Thank you. Go on. So we've got phthalates, we've got preservatives, we've got antibacterial agents. These are just...
I know. I could go on and on, but I'll just give you one more for personal care, which is another type of preservative, a paraben. And people have quite a bit of awareness around parabens now, but not everybody, as you said when we first started chatting, so I always like to mention them. But be wary, because the next generation of preservatives that a lot of these paraben-free companies have started using is phenoxyethanol. And there is nascent, as in like just coming out, research that is suggesting that it might be damaging to the liver and kidneys. And that's an animal trial, animal study, but given we're from nature as well, I always think that's enough caution for me, especially when there are so many brands not using these sorts of preservatives. So
paraben is another group of preservatives.
A paraben is a type of, so you've got methylparaben, propylparaben, those sorts of things, and then phenoxyethanol, the one that has replaced parabens in many, many cases.
Yep.
Those would be my main ones, because if you get those hormone disruptors out of there, chances are you're not going to need to decipher the rest of 90% of what's on a mainstream shelf and just switch to more natural, simple brands.
And it is this point about synergism that is so important, isn't it? Because, you know, none of these chemicals we are exposed to in isolation.
No, that's right. And Professor Mark Cohen, who I know you've interviewed, as have I, is really passionate about this being a gaping hole in the research as to whether things are safe or not. And I totally agree.
Well, when you think about this gold standard being a randomised control study where you isolate one thing at a time and test it, it's a sort of a oxymoron, really, isn't it? You can't do that unless you test combinations. But the issue of personal care products and home care products included in that is just so huge. And I know you cover it in your Low Tox Living course. And I know you'll cover it in your book. Let's move on now to foods, because it's a big one. But I know we look around the supermarket and plastic is everywhere surrounding foods. Tell us a bit about some of the problems with that.
Well, again, our phthalates come out to play, the plasticizer compounds. So you find this in a lot of cheap, very bendy, thin plastics. And so, of course, it stands to reason that that would be in food packaging. And a lot of BPA in plastics in food packaging. So two big endocrine disruptors that are used commonly in food packaging plastics. And the issue there, you might think, oh, but it's just pasta and it's in a plastic thing. And that's true to a certain extent. It's not as likely to leach as, say, heating something in a hot plastic bowl in the microwave. There are always degrees of things. But when I interviewed environmental scientist Dr. Peter Dingle for my Go Low Tox course a few years ago now, he took us through the research to suggest that it's about the amount of time a food has spent sitting on a shelf or being shipped around the world in these plastic packages, as well as the environmental circumstance in which they're in as they get transported around. So I like to use the example of like a big truck with a whole bunch of pallets of bottled water in it. And while that bottled water is intended to be drunk at room temperature and not necessarily hugely damaging to human health, certainly not if it was just packaged like last week, let's say, it then gets parked outside waiting for a loading dock to open in the hot beaming sun, and you get the picture. So heat and plastic are really, really the big enemy, which is why there's so much fantastic education out there around not microwaving things in plastics, for example.
Or leaving your water bottle in your car.
Which
is a classic.
Yeah, or, as the research suggests, refilling your water bottle over and over again, because plastic weakens over time, and then that's when you increase the possibility of something leaching. So it's really, it's a tough one because it's really hard to totally whittle out your plastic. So I really tell people to just not panic here and do the best you can. So think 80-20. Buy your produce from a market so that you don't have to buy herbs that are wrapped in plastic, and sort of start to make a few things like a couple of cakes, couple of crackers, things that you might have for the lunchbox and all that kind of stuff that you get really good at, your signature kind of recipes, because a lot of people feel like they have to make these new things for their kids all the time. No, just get good at stuff so that you're actually motivated to just whip it up with your eyes closed at 8 o'clock in the evening before you sit down on the couch. Of course, it's daunting to start something brand new from scratch from a recipe book, but it's not daunting to do something you've done 10 times before. So start sort of making your own stuff so that you don't have to buy as much that's prepackaged as well.
And as you work your way up and down the aisles, even the fruit and vegetable sections, the meat sections, the cheese, everything is wrapped in plastic. I mean, it's almost impossible to escape. But as you say, and then you go to the grower's market, I guess what you could do, like when you go to the butcher, you buy meat, but there they put it into a plastic bag or it's wrapped in. You've really got to, it's a real consciousness raising exercise, this, isn't it?
It really is. And you're not going to get it all done in a week. So it's really just about picking your low-hanging fruit, pardon the pun, to start with, and going, right, okay, these are the 3 or 4 things I can commit to this month, and then start getting a bit more savvy, keeping a couple of Pyrex containers in your boot so that you can go to the butcher and get the bacon put straight in there. But legally, they have to pick things up with a plastic glove and a plastic bag. That's their law. So even though you don't take the plastic home, unfortunately, it doesn't mean the plastic doesn't get used, which is a huge shame.
And storage of food, that's another one, isn't it? In the way we store our own food in our own homes.
So the best thing you can do is buy a whole bunch of flip-top lid jars from, even from IKEA. Super reasonable. A lot of supermarkets even sell them, so you don't need to buy some designer brand, and start moving everything over from plastic containers to glass wherever you can, and then for water bottles, glass or stainless steel, both great.
Yeah, that is a great investment. Now, you also run a program on preconception health, and I know this is a really important subject because it clearly sets you up for life.
Yeah.
And it's an enormous topic. I know. I don't want to, but what are some of the things we should be aware of as we're planning for families?
So a lot of people get married and start trying for a baby straight away. And if you've lived a modern urban lifestyle, that could involve things like lots of drinking on the weekends, even party drugs, all that kind of stuff in your 20s. If you've travelled a lot, if you've smoked, if you've worked yourself to the bone and you're a really stressed out individual, even if you've just exposed yourself to a whole bunch of environmental chemicals, if you don't filter your water, all these sorts of things, we're not told that any of this reduces our chances of a healthy conception. None of it. We're never told about any of that when we visit the GP. We're never taken through a bit of a environment and lifestyle questionnaire before we think of having a baby. We're just... we get our iron and our folate tested, and then we also get a shot if we don't have our rubella antibodies anymore. And it's just not enough. That is not preconception care in the way that a 2018 couple going into the preconception phase needs to be informed. It's very different to the life that our grandparents were leading when they decided to have babies. And it's unfortunate, but it is the reality. And I'm a big fan of having that hard, heavy day where you go, actually, I got to learn this and I've got to realise that I've got to do some work here before we do the horizontal tango or pop to the IVF clinic if you're on your own having a baby. And there's so much you can do. So I really came at this from a very personal angle, which was a very easy conception. So that I was eternally grateful for, and no miscarriage. It obviously went through to term, and I was a one-hit wonder. I just felt very complete with my one little guy. And unfortunately, though, in the 12-week scan, we found out we had a single umbilical artery, so there should be 2, and we only had 1. Then he was a failure to progress emergency C-section baby. Then we found out he had a small hole in the heart, which gratefully it closed over. And then after a terrible experience trying to breastfeed and him finally rejecting the whole thing because it just wasn't very satisfying because he was never getting enough food at about 4 months, we didn't find out until your lovely nephew diagnosed a mild tongue tie when he was 5.5.
You're talking about Dr. Lewis Ehrlich in the dental practice. He wasn't not a paediatrician, but it was in the dental practice.
No, that's right. Yeah. A dentist.
Yeah.
So, and I had the biggest eureka moment when Lewis identified it, and I was like, "You are kidding me! I knew something was wrong. It wasn't,
Because he was having trouble breastfeeding, and you kind of put it down to, I just don't have enough milk, or it's just not happening.
That's right.
But in
And
fact, he just wasn't latching on properly because of his tongue tie.
100%. And he took 50 to an hour to feed on one side. I mean, all the clues are there if you look back in retrospect. So all of this into account, when I then learnt about a test that you could do to find out about your folate metabolism, your ability to turn folic acid into the active form of folate that your body needs, I found out that I was homozygous, so in the C667 MTHFR gene.
Yeah, now just to explain to our listener, go on, the MTHFR, I'm not even going to tell you what that stands for, but it's all about methylation, which is a really important process in our bodies, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And you can either have, I'm similarly, I've got two genes that are deficient in that methylation process, which I only realised later in life too. But this affected, go on, tell us how this affected you.
Yes. So then in retrospect, you think back to that first blood test that you had at the GPs, and this is absolutely nothing against doctors. We're all just operating from the sphere in which we work in and know. But it was just what I did before having a baby. And I remember her saying, your folic acid levels are sky high. This is fantastic. It actually just meant I wasn't getting any, and it was super high in my blood trying to get to where it needed to go. Because I couldn't convert it. So there we were all thinking, yay, folic acid high, tick, tick, tick. But meanwhile, my body was craving it. And when you don't have enough bioavailable folate in your body, what are the risks? Single umbilical artery, failure to progress labour, hole in the heart, tongue tie. And I was like, and I've just got goosebumps just saying them out loud again now. I just could not believe that such a simple test for $50 that you can pay for yourself if your doctor doesn't want to do it through Medicare for you. You can get it done through Medicare if you've had multiple miscarriages. There is the irony, because miscarriage is one of the other symptoms. You can get this test for $50. You can take a type of folate like folinic acid, or if you can handle it based on the way you methylate, you can take the methylfolate. I don't do particularly well on that personally, so folinic acid is what I would take. And then you would actually get that folate that you need. Now, I think back to that pregnancy, and something that I did every single day was defrost one of those packets of frozen spinach that you can buy at the supermarket. And I used to just defrost it, put a pat of butter on it, and eat it just like that. It was just something I felt that I had to have every single day. And I think that's just the most incredible miracle that our bodies still have those instincts to crave certain foods to try and get the nutrients you need.
Yeah. So how old is Sebastian now?
He's a gorgeous, big, healthy 8.5-year-old boy.
8.5-year-old. So this is a major motivation for you to find out a little bit more.
Yes, that's right. So
personal story there.
That's right. Huge. And I think, our messes become our greatest messages. And I really am a huge believer in that, because while it wasn't the messiest of circumstances by any stretch, I've worked with and learnt of many more people with tragic stories. But what I think we can do is we can do this whole preconception thing much better, much more positively, with much less heartbreak and much less complications along the way if we just learn a little bit. So while I've mentioned one test, one of our modules is actually going through all the tests that you should have. You shouldn't just get your TSH tested. You should get your TSH, T4, T3, reverse T3, and thyroid antibodies, for example, a full thyroid panel.
Yeah, complete thyroid panel to check for thyroid function, which is a pretty big problem and growing in our society.
Exactly. And then a few more, and we talked to wonderful functional med GP Sandy Yun about that difference between what normal is and what optimal is, depending on the individual, because that's going to be different in your lead up, depending on your background and the kind of lifestyle you've lived. And then the stress piece, and I know you're super passionate about stress, Ron, given you've written a whole book on it. But it is just such an important one, and that is one that, the man and the woman both have to be in tip-top shape, and stress is such a huge part of the modern lifestyle to address before you go in. So there's that, and we talk about environmental chemicals, like the best ones you can reduce for leading up to pregnancy, and it's a really great course that just helps empower people in that stage.
Now, given we are exposed to so much, and hey, look, when I was in my 20s, I was giving it a bit of a nudge as well. What do you think is a good lead time if people were saying, hey, we're going to have kids, but let's be, as you love, I love this term, preconception ninjas. That's your term of your course, I think it is, or something. But how long do you think we should be thinking and starting to clean up our act, preconception?
Well, look, a year is brilliant, but 3 months is amazing too. It's never like, I've missed the boat, I might as well just start trying because I didn't spend enough time preparing and I might as well just jump in there and get the baby. Anything as little as 3 months, but a year is optimal based on all of the practitioners and doctors that we researched with and have interviewed for the course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fantastic. Wow, there's just so much. I mean, I know you do so much. Now, you've got this book, and I have actually read a draft copy of it. Thank you. And
you're welcome.
I really,
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed it. It's an amazing book. Tell us a bit about the book and I mean, obviously why you've written it, but there's so much in there.
Yeah, so the Low Tox Life came not because I decided it needed to be written, but the lovely Jane Morrow, publisher from Murdoch Books, approached me, and I always thought I was going to do a cookbook first as a published book, but she had other ideas and really challenged me to think about this beautiful community that I'd built and all the topics that we cared about and how I would go about putting into 60,000 words, which when you think about the end of my course book for Go Low Tox is 130,000 words. I'm not short of a word, so not just doing chemicals, but also food and mind and home. It was going to be quite tricky to make that into a concise little guide. But I did, and I wrote a contents page, and I thought, actually, this could really work. And so the idea is that we take this idea of a low tox life, we look at what we can do in the home, in the body, on the body, in the food that we choose, and with our minds to lead a life that is more healthy for us and definitely happier for our beautiful planet.
Yeah. Well, I loved it. And it's coming out I think in July, isn't it? Is that when it's coming out?
Yes, July 1, but you can pre-order it now from Book Depository or what's the other one? Booktopia. That's right.
We'll have links to all that. We'll have links to all that.
It was amazing. Literally just this morning I got an email saying the pre-order was up. And I was like, oh, goodness, here we go.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
Wait until you get the finished printed copy in your hands.
I can't even imagine what that's going to be like.
But listen, I just wanted to ask you this question. What do you think the biggest challenge to people on their health journey through their lives in our modern world is? What do you think that is?
Gosh, well, the biggest challenge is that we've been taught that change doesn't feel good. Anyone that grew up in the 80s, 90s, the age of the Oprah taking us on the next diet and the next diet and the next diet, and change just hasn't felt good for X-Gen and baby boomers, and to a certain extent Y-Gen as well. Millennials are much more adaptive, and they're much more open to new concepts, ideas, etc. But because so many of us in the Gen X age group are getting sick because of these decades that we've lived through genetic modification, through preservatives and extremely processed foods, through a huge amount of environmental toxins compared to any generation before us. We know that a lot needs to change, but change feels daunting, overwhelming, and not quantifiable in a way that might prove worth it. So I think for me it's a psychology piece that's one of our greatest barriers. Because a lot of people will see a TED Talk, like the amazing TED Talk of Al Gore's on the polar ice caps and climate change, but it'll just be so monumental a problem that we just won't know what to do. Or the classic is someone with rheumatoid arthritis who kind of knows that maybe changing all their food and not having the pizzas and the gluten and the dairy and the eggs and all those sorts of things, it's just too hard. We don't feel connected enough to a sense of why we're here anymore, and we don't feel connected enough to nature to fight for either of these things in a way that's profound. And one of my favourite things to do is to help people piece that together so that change becomes beautiful, becomes empowering, and becomes something that you love so much that you be the change and you just naturally incite curiosity from those around you. Because if we just keep going on, this is wrong and that is bad and we're all going to die because of this temperature increase, it clearly does not work to do that. No one's making enough change for us to massively affect any new or positive outcomes.
Well, you do that very well, Alexx, because I've done your course, Low Tox Living, and I've read your book, and you do it very well. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, such a pleasure always such a pleasure to chat. Thank you, Ron.
Interesting that Alexx should pick change as a major challenge that people face, because ultimately when you become aware of issues, confusing public health messages, stressors or pillars of health, you can either shrug your shoulders and say that's interesting but nothing changes, or you could take it on board and make some changes. I've actually been intrigued by managing change for quite a few years, and I've always thought there were two keys to help me manage change. The first is referred to as locus of control. Do you believe you primarily, not exclusively, after all, we do live in the real world, do you primarily feel you have control of your life? If you do, that's referred to as an internal locus of control. An excellent example was my guest today, Alexx Stuart. I know I also have a strong internal locus of control, a strong sense that I do have a lot of control over what happens in my life. The opposite is an external locus of control. Things are just out of your hands. In a sense, you become or feel a victim. The second issue that helps us in incorporating change is a tolerance of ambiguity. Now, while we all love certainty and are drawn to simple answers and solutions, the reality is that's not how our bodies work, it's not how the world works. Full of contradictions, confounding issues, having a healthy tolerance of ambiguity, accepting things aren't always black and white in life, makes managing change in your own life easier. Alexx also, and I love this, alluded to the 80-20 rule, which I must say that's how I approach all of these complex issues and challenges. You have to decide what's acceptable for you. Is your life 50-50? 50% of the time you're eating really well, sleeping well, exercising, etc., but the other 50% you just let it rip? Personally, I don't think that's ideal. Nor for me is 60-40 or even 70-30. I think for me 80-20 is at least where I like to be, and when I'm doing really well, when I'm on fire, 90-10 is fabulous. So having had cancer myself, I try to be closer to that level. If I go to 100%, I think I could really irritate my family, my friends, my patients. I could be a social outcast. Anyway, that's just how I feel. What about you? What's your percentage? Now, we also mentioned MTHFR, which is a gene mutation influencing your ability to methylate, which makes things, vitamins, nutrients, bioavailable, able to be used by the body, particularly to methylate, say, B group vitamins. You're meant to be able to convert folic acid to folate to utilise in lots of important biochemical functions. MTHFR has been linked to a wide range of signs and symptoms like childhood behavioural development problems, depression and anxiety, autoimmune disorders, of which there are now over 80, and including some common thyroid disorders. With MTHFR, deficiencies may occur in B group vitamins, as you heard, folate, also B12, B6, B2, calcium, magnesium, iron, vitamin D and vitamin K. So vitamin K, of course, is so important for bone health. Also selenium and vitamin A. Alexx runs some great courses: Low Tox Living, Real Food Rockstars, Preconception Ninja, and has written a new book called Low Tox Living, coming out in July. So I hope you enjoyed that chat we had. Don't forget to give us some feedback, send us some suggestions. Even better, go on to iTunes and leave some reviews. So until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own